We're now looking at part 2, which is the plot and analysis. And aren't you glad I didn't use my finger to write out the rest of this, and I typed it out because that looks terrible. My apologies. So part 2, plot. These are the essential questions you need to be able to answer by the end of this lecture. What are the 5 parts of a story's plot? So you're going to see the chart on page 26, and we're going to go through those parts. Okay, so what are the 5 parts? What questions will help me analyze plot? And 3 words I'm going to be explaining to you as we go. Complications, say it. Complications. Suspense. Suspense. And outcome. Outcome. Okay, so take a moment, set up your notes. Now, there's a lot of information on this page that will be incredibly useful to you throughout this year together, that by the end of this year you should have internalized, that you know it, you can say it, you can use it without having to look at your notes, without having to look in your book. But in the meantime, as we're learning this new material, I don't want you to spend your time copying. I'd rather you spend your time taking notes and then reviewing your notes. I'm going to be providing the copy here. So give me a moment as I pass out a notes copy from page 26 that you can fold and tape or glue in later into your notebook so that you'll have this page as a quick reference, but you're also going to be taking notes to help your understanding. Anytime you have your hand working as well as your eyes and your ears, you've got multiple modalities and senses working. Your brain is creating new pathways and you're learning more. You will retain or remember more. So regardless of whether a teacher says to you, "I'm grading your notes, you need to take notes," regardless, you need to take notes to help yourself learn and remember the information. Okay, that's my lecture. So story and plot and story analysis. A story is much more than the world in which the action unfolds. So setting is important, but it's not the entire story. The real power of a story comes from what happens in that world. The world is created with setting and mood. And then what? So what? What happens? Most stories follow a plot. What is plot? Plot is a chain of events that trace a conflict or struggle between opposing forces. Okay? When we taught little kids, we said problem. The plot is the characters move towards solving a problem or figuring out how to live with this problem. The academic, secondary, and college word we're using here is conflict. And what is conflict? It's a struggle. And you can't see me doing it right now as I make this video, but here I am doing it in real life. I am pushing my 2 fists together. It's a struggle between 2 opposing forces. So the conflict can be internal, inside a character, taking place within the mind of a character, or it can be an external conflict between a character and an outside force, such as another character, society, or nature. And I'm sure you've heard before, man versus man, man versus society, man versus nature, man versus himself. Those are the types of conflict that we have identified as very common in fiction. Okay, so plot is usually talked about in terms of these 5 stages. Keep in mind, however, that not every story follows this exact structure. Wow, wouldn't that be boring? Authors, writers are creative people, so they're often coming up with ways to turn the plot stages around. Okay, so there are 5 basic steps you need to know, but keep in mind and be aware that they can be shifted around a bit to make stories different, more interesting. So here are the 5 parts, the stages of a typical plot. Let's start with the parts, and then we'll talk about the questions for each part. Exposition. Say the word exposition. An exposition exposes, at the beginning of the story, the setting, characters, and establishes the mood. Okay, exposition, the part of the story that introduces the setting and the characters and establishes the mood. It may, and it usually, will reveal the conflict or set the stage for it. Like get you ready for what is the main problem, the main conflict the characters have in the story. That's called the exposition. It's exposing the basic things you need to know as you go through a story. So I have to tell you, I always tell students to slow down during the exposition and read it through it a couple of times to look for the setting, the characters, and the conflict. You need to know that to help you understand the rest of the story. Okay, so exposition, rising action. So complications arise. Complications arise as the main character struggles to resolve the conflict. And we say this, dun dun dun, the plot thickens as suspense builds. So something's happening, rising action. Complication, say that word. Complications, what does that mean? Complication is, okay, so the goal is in sight. You see where you're going. But 2 more problems have to be solved before you can get there. So you have your main problem and then you have little problems that are making it harder. They are complicating your situation. That's called a complication. Complication. Okay, and suspense, of course, means how will the story end? So right here, the plot thickens. Dun, dun, dun. Climax, the turning point of the story. Okay, so we've got our exposition, our rising action, and now the moment of greatest suspense, right? The person's hanging from the edge of the building. Will they make it to the top or will they fall? That's an exaggeration, but this is the climax of the story. What will happen? The greatest suspense. Often, the main character makes a decision or takes an action that makes the outcome of the conflict clear. Not always. Okay? But often, the main character will either decide something or do something that makes the end of the story, the outcome of the conflict, obvious or clear. Falling action. The story is not quite over. This stage shows the results of the decision or the action that happened at the climax. So, and then what happens? What's next? Tension eases as the conflict is resolved. Okay, everything's okay. How does the rest of the person's day go? Or how does their life go? Or what happens? How is everything being resolved? And you just heard me say the word resolved, and the last stage is called the resolution. Now, the resolution, the end of the story, reveals the final outcome of the story and ties up loose ends. So sometimes the resolution is, and they lived happily ever after. Or, and she never broke into the house again. Right, Goldilocks. So how does it all end? The final outcome. So what? The resolution. Okay, so that's the basic level of understanding. But the basic level of understanding will only get you so far. It's one thing to identify and say, exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. But so what? Great, you know these 5 terms. You need to know how to use the structure of fiction to help you make meaning and analyze what you're reading. That is what secondary and college level reading is aimed at. Analysis, interacting with the text. So, these are some very important questions that good readers ask, strong academic readers ask. And if you're not asking them now, you will be by the end of this year. So during the exposition, a strong reader will ask himself, herself, what details help to establish the setting and create a mood? Looking for details that show the setting, that show the mood. What kind of person is the main character? And we talk about character traits. Looking for the character traits. What do we know about the main character? What kind of person are they? And what, if anything, is revealed about the conflict? What clues are there about the problem or conflict in the story? Man versus nature, man versus society, man versus himself. What is the problem? 3 great questions that strong readers ask themselves. Okay, now looking at great questions strong readers ask during the rising action. So you're asking yourself, what is the central conflict? And you're looking at the text for clues to help you understand what is the main or central conflict. What's the problem here? What's going on? You ask yourself, how do the characters respond to the conflict? Which is very important. They have a problem. How do they act? How do they respond? That tells you about the character's traits. How does the conflict become more complicated? Okay, we're reading more difficult text this year, next year, and so on for the rest of your life. Ha ha ha. So, noticing how the authors move away from the simple story, like Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, a very simple story, to a more complicated story. So how is the conflict becoming more complicated? Small problems coming out here, there, and everywhere. And climax. What questions do strong readers ask themselves during the climax to analyze the story? What decision or action has the main character made or taken? Very important. What did the main character do or decide that is leading to this climax or leading out of it? What impact might this decision or action have on the characters, the other characters in the story, and the conflict? What impact? So what? Impact. So what? This decision, this action, so what? How does it affect the rest of the story? And how might the conflict be ended, be resolved? How might the problem be fixed? So here, this is a prediction piece. You're predicting as you read through the climax, how is this going to end? Based on the questions and the answers that you've gotten from your analysis so far. All this good stuff. Now, during the falling action, this stage shows the results of this decision, right? So you ask yourself, what is the result? What is the outcome of the main character's decision or action? What is the outcome? And what steps does the main character take to resolve the conflict? So what does the main character do to resolve the conflict? And for the resolution, the ending, everything's tied up with a little ribbon on it. You ask yourself, how? How have the events, and again, events is what happens in the story, right? The events of the plot. How have the events and the conflicts affected or changed the characters? One of the first essays that you're going to write in your junior English class, English 5-6, has to do with a character changing over time. Whether a character was static and did not change, or whether the character was dynamic and changed throughout the story. And the last question, through the resolution, what message might the writer be suggesting? So, of course, we're talking about theme. We're going to come back to theme later on in the year. But the message, the meaning. Okay? So let's look at that list again. It's an excellent list that we'll be working on as we look at fiction. And remember, this is what, by the end of the year, you will automatically, without prompting from me, be asking yourself as you read fiction.